This is the BBC.
Hello, I'm Tom Holland. Thank you for downloading this edition of Making History. Today, the history of street food, how the Romans fed their armies, and why Anglo-Saxons loved wild boars. Well, we're a fortnight on from New Year, and so I think it's time to forget about resolutions and diets and tuck into the four-course historical feast we have on the menu for you today. First up,
I got Italian sausage, porchetta and burgers.
I do Japanese food with Filipino fusion.
Pork stew with cheese, peppers and onions.
Today, street food in Britain has a global flavour, but it was there being sold in our cities long before the arrival of samosas and gyoza on these shores. For our second course, we visit Wales in search of the Roman diet.
At least a quarter of the animals that were consumed here in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD did not come from South Wales.
So where did all those Romans get their food? The pasty takes on the sausage as Cornwall meets Cumberland in top-town history. And Izzy Lawrence discovers why the Anglo-Saxons had a taste for porkies. With me here in the Making History Pantry of Plenty, the finest sous chef in the business, cook and food historian, Dr. Annie Gray. 20 or 30 years ago, many street markets were on their last legs. Most people found a trip by car to the comfortable environ of a supermarket or a chain store more appetising than a trek round market stalls, particularly if it was cold or wet. Today, though, markets are increasingly where many more affluent people choose to shop, and it's food and drink that's helped to revitalise them. First, there were farmers' markets. Now, the craze is for street food. Pop-up stalls serving dishes from around the world to be eaten on the move or at a bar. It feels new, hipster-tastic, but in reality, street food has been a part of life in British towns and cities for centuries. We asked Hester Cant to work through her lunch hour and find out more for us about the home-cooked history of what is now a style of eating with a decidedly global flavour.
My name is George. I got Italian sausage. I make my own sausages, porchetta and burgers.
My name is Kathy Hobb, and I do Japanese food with Filipino fusion.
Bristol's Harbourside Street Food Market. It's one of the many places in the city serving street food, and as you'll know, now it's one of hundreds of taste-tingling places up and down the UK where you can think locally but eat globally.
And what food are you serving?
I sell Brazilian food.
Are you a Brazilian person?
Yeah, I'm Brazilian, yeah.
So what are you making here?
Feijoada, which is the pork stew, which is 500 years old recipe.
As an international city, Bristol has been home to all sorts of foods from around the globe for centuries. But, as is often the case, London, 120 miles away, probably leads the way with this culinary past.
By the 19th century, as London becomes this great modern city, you could almost spend a day eating on the streets of London. Such was the vast quantity of stuff available.
Charlie Taverner is currently researching his PhD on London's street food sellers from the 17th to 19th centuries.
For a long time we've thought kind of street sellers were marginal people just stuck on the fringes of society, scraping a living by selling awful quality food. But with recent research, we're starting to think actually these people were playing a much more substantial role, both in the city's economy, in supplying the food that people needed to eat, but also in its culture. Their cries, the calls they made to shout out what they were selling were an important way that people understood and navigated their way through the streets of London.
But who were the most prevalent sellers crying out on the streets of London? Given their luxurious status in present day, you may be surprised by the seafood in question.
The oyster seller was one of the most popular street characters in London at this time, both in the popular imagination, in visual art, in song and in poems. The oyster seller was characterised as a damsel selling these salty fish that men would swallow down. So there's plenty of innuendo and kind of sexualised imagery going on. And Pepys often talks about sending someone out to go and pick up some oysters which he'll then kind of greedily eat at home.
As the people arriving into London changed, so did the street food. Soon all manner of ingredients and cuisines were beginning to find their place on the streets of the big city.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, probably one of the biggest international food influences on the streets of the city was citrus fruit. These oranges, lemons would pour off the boats and then be picked up, perhaps in the markets, by the street traders who would then spread them to all corners of the city. Into the 19th century, the international influences grow even stronger. London at this time has a large Jewish community, Irish community, French immigrants, other people from the continent, and are all bringing with them different food that they might have eaten at home, and also changing the food culture of Britain.
Charlie Taverner with Making History's Hester Cant. Annie Gray here in the studio with me, no one better to talk about the interface of food and history than you. We've been hearing in those pieces about how immigrants into Bristol and London revolutionised street food. Both those cities, of course, are ports. What about British cities that aren't, Birmingham, Manchester, so on?
Well, I mean, there's been street food as long as there have been people, really. So if you've got a gathering of people in one place, someone will turn up and sell them something nice to eat. But you do find immigrant communities are quite important in spreading certain street foods out. And one of the biggest communities for that is really the Italian community. So
and when are they arriving?
You've got them really coming in the 19th century. So throughout the 19th century, there are successive waves of people fleeing persecution or war in their native countries. It has ever been thus. You think about the Huguenots coming in the 17th century, they brought with them the Savoy sausage. Well, the Italians who came in the 19th century really were the pioneers of street food in terms of ice cream. And you had Italian communities in lots of cities, not just those that were ports. Wherever you've got a little Italy, eventually around the late 19th century, you had Italian immigrants making ice cream in really quite nasty conditions and selling them on the streets in barrows.
And what about probably Britain's most famous street food, fish and chips?
Well, fish and chips is very well known for coming out of the Jewish East End. I mean, the East End goes through waves and waves and waves of different people moving in and moving out.
The Jews are adding to the culinary mix.
Exactly. So if you look at something like what is today the Brick Lane Mosque, that's been successively a Huguenot church, it's been a Methodist chapel, it's been a synagogue, and now it's a mosque, reflecting very much the movement of people into an area that was very, very cheap and then progressively out again. Fish and chips started life with Jewish communities, or at least fried fish did, because it was one of the things that could be eaten under religious law.
And do we have, nowadays we have people go to Brick Lane for curries. Was that something that, would you have people in the 19th century going to eat Jewish food in the East End?
To some extent, yes. The East End was known as this kind of den of debauchery and sin and opium and all the bad things that went on.
What's
and
not to like?
Well, quite. And it was a real source of fascination for the middle classes, who developed this activity called slumming, where they would go and tour the slums, sometimes dressed up as tramps and sometimes not. So they were going in and writing feverishly about all these interesting foods.
And eating street food?
And eating street food. You had street food right across London. So while you had West Enders going over to the East End to eat street food, they did also have their own street food in their own areas. And I think it's quite important not to think of street food as something that's only related to the very poor. If you were a theatre goer, you'd find there was someone selling you
or going
sweets.
to church, perhaps.
If you were going to church on a Sunday morning and you wanted breakfast, there'd be the muffin man. And you have the cries of London, the muffin man, the winkle person. You'd have people selling peas. You might get Norfolk biffins, which are little apples shriveled up. You get apple fritters. Of course, you get chestnuts. There are lots of shades of street food.
I'd love to see the winkle person make a comeback. This is Making History on BBC Radio 4. Coming up, Izzy Lawrence surfs hyperlink history. But first to the contest which demands the adversarial skills of a barrister and the historical passion of a passionate historian. Yes, the game that is far from pointless.
Top Town History!
Top Town History, the game of local knowledge where you, the Making History listener, get to make the case for the place where you live, having the most fascinating history of anywhere in the UK and seeing off your rivals as you do so. Today, after last week's remarkable feat of giant killing, which saw Fort William finally fall, we welcome back the village of Lincolnhorn near Launceston in Cornwall and local journalist Simon Parker. And this week's newcomer from beautiful Cumbria, Helen Wall, who thinks that Barrow in Furness is, historically speaking, where it's at. Helen, welcome. Simon, welcome back. Simon, last week you were making the case for Cornwall, a place famous across the UK for its beauty as a holiday destination, as a centre of industry, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. I mean, Cornwall is very much seen by people outside Cornwall as a place for coming on holiday. But of course, it was a powerhouse for industry, particularly in the 19th century, with mining, engineering and other innovations.
And Helen, you were from Cumbria. the Lake District, again, famous for its beauty. But again, Cumbria is a centre of industry.
It certainly is. Cumbria has always been a very hard-working place, right from Langdale stone axes, which were honed to perfection on Barrow shores.
Well, we look forward to hearing whether you make the case for Barrow-in-Furness as a centre of industry in your presentation for Top Town History. But first, as the defending champion, it's Simon's going to go first. Simon, you are going to talk for a minute. At the end, you've given us a piece of audio which will reflect the case that you've been making. We've got a minute. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Go.
Person, Daniel Gum. Event, the murder of Vicar Richard Perrin. Place, St Mellors Church. All linked by faith or a lack of it. Welcome back to Lincolnhorn, where the devil was born. No one knows for sure why this Cornish parish is so linked with Lucifer, but the story may go back to 1411, when religious conspirators murdered Vicar Richard Perrin, dragging him from his horse and stabbing him multiple times. His unknown killers were branded satellites of Satan by the bishop. Poor old Perrin was vicar of a church dedicated to St Mellor, canonised in the 10th century after his severed hands were replaced with metal prosthetics, and miraculously functioned as if made of flesh and bone. But not everyone in Lincolnhorn believed in miracles. Daniel Gum, an 18th century mathematician, mountain philosopher and stonemason, lived in a hut high on the moor. Though happy to accept church cash for
15
doing
seconds
repairs on
left.
the headstones, Gum refused to step inside to worship. His epitaph reads, "Here I lie by the churchyard door, here I lie because I am poor. The further in, the more you pay, yet here I lie as warm as hay, as they."
And that's your minute up with 2 seconds to spare. Tell us what the sound was.
The sound is the crashing of the door closed and the slamming and locking of the bolts. I like to think that it's shutting out Daniel Gum, who didn't want to worship there.
So Lincolnhorn as the birthplace of the devil, centre of religious schism. Helen, how are you going to compete? Can we hear your case for Barrow-in-Furness? You have 1 minute starting now.
It's 1845. My place is Barrow-in-Furness, a remote and ancient village of 30 houses which is about to become unique in British history. My person is Henry Schneider, who's come to Barrow to develop the existing small-scale iron ore mining. My event is that after a few disappointing years, he decides to give it up, but his workforce insists they will work for 1 more week for no pay. They discover one of the biggest deposits of hematite the world has ever seen. It's a rare type, perfect for the newly invented Bessemer steel-making process. In 1865, the biggest and best Bessemer steel mill in the world was started in Barrow, providing steel worldwide and employing 5,000 workers, all squashed into this little village because that is the story of Barrow. Mass migration. Housing crises, people screaming for infrastructure. Does it ring any bells? It's about the skills and the trades and the ingenuity and the sheer hard graft of thousands of working men and women who are determined to come here, build a town, make a home.
And that's it. That's your time is up. Fantastic presentation. What was the sound?
Well, Barrow, of course, is now famous for shipbuilding. The steel led to that. And it's a brilliant thing that happens at midnight and New Year. All the ships roundabout start to blow their hooters at midnight to ring in the new year, and we all go outside to listen to it, and it's very moving.
And Helen, your presentation, although it was, you were talking about history, not without an element of contemporary resonance as well. So Helen, thanks ever so much. Simon, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
So, Annie, listening to that, on previous episodes in Making History, we've had more than one person in the studio, and so the winner has been decided on a democratic vote. This week, you are alone, so we're going to jettison democracy in favour of autocracy. The decision is yours exclusively.
Well, my blood has been stirred by both, I think. But I've got to give it to Lincolnhorn, really just because of the phrase satellites of Satan. I think that's a winner in anybody's view.
So Satan and Lincolnhorn it is. Cornwall lives to fight another day, but congratulations to Helen Wall for a really fantastic presentation there. And don't forget, if you think your town is the top town for history, please do drop us a line and join in the fun. The email address is making.history@bbc.co.uk. Now, it's always been recognised in military circles that an army marches on its stomach. Roman commanders 2,000 years ago were quite as committed to keeping their men well fed as any modern general. The legions did a lot of marching, so much in fact that they ended up marching into Wales. Now, to the Romans, the culinary delights of Britain were not obvious. The lack of wine and olives, and the repellent enthusiasm of the Britons for drinking milk, provoked much negative comment. Add to that the risk of overextending the supply line, always something the Romans were alert to when fighting mobile enemies, and it is evident that keeping thousands of soldiers fed as they battled the Welsh tribes must have been a major preoccupation. So, how did the Romans do it? Remarkably, this is a question that historians have tended to neglect. Until now, that is. New technology is enabling scientists and archaeologists at Cardiff University to work out from where the occupants of an important Roman fort in South Wales obtained their food. Helen Castor has been to a market, a struggling one, I'm afraid, to find out more.
Newport's Covered Market is a splendid Victorian building, a big arched roof high above me, 2 floors, so much room here, but it's a shadow of its former self. I'm here with Dr. Peter Guest, Senior Lecturer in Archaeology at Cardiff University. Peter, if we're thinking about food supplies in the past, am I right in thinking that generally people had to eat locally?
Sometimes what we think was the case actually turns out not to be entirely correct. And where we are now, we're not far from one of the biggest Roman legionary bases in Britain. And new research is beginning to show that perhaps things weren't quite so simple nearly 2,000 years ago as we imagine.
Where was that base and how big was it?
The legionary base was at a place today called Caerleon, which is just north of Newport, and there were about 5,500 men in a Roman legion, so it was a substantial settlement, and they needed to be fed and they needed to be maintained.
How did the Romans do that?
Well, until recently, we didn't really have the answers to that kind of question. The study that we undertook showed that at least a quarter of the animals that were consumed here in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD did not come from South Wales. They came from other parts of Britain, mainly central and eastern England, but it's very possible that they came from further afield, from northern England, southern Scotland, parts of northern France, Normandy, Brittany, that sort of area.
Okay, so at the moment I'm just cutting a surface of dental enamel. My name is Richard Madgwick and I'm a lecturer in archaeological science at Cardiff University.
Richard, that's horribly reminiscent of a trip to the dentist. What are you up to?
Okay, I'm currently drilling some enamel from a pig's tooth from Caerleon, and I'm extracting that enamel because locked into that dental enamel is a real wealth of information. You are what you eat, and you are also where you eat. So every time humans and animals consume food, chemical signals from that produce enters the body and ultimately manifests itself in different tissues.
So that is information that gets laid down almost as an archaeological record within the structure of the body.
Precisely. And teeth, they don't change, so they give us a snapshot of what that person was consuming and where they were living or where they were getting their food from during their early years.
Now, I think I might be beginning to see how this all links up. So, the animals whose bones and teeth you found at Caerleon, you can tell where they were when they were baby animals because of what's in their teeth?
That's pretty much how it works, yes. So we're not quite at the level of getting a postcode quite yet, but it can give us an indication of the geological region where that individual was raised.
The archaeological scientist Richard Madgwick, with Helen in the labs at Cardiff University. Annie, we tend perhaps to think of supply chains being a very modern thing, but clearly not. I wonder, how far can you transport meat in a pre-industrial era?
Well, it largely depends on the state the meat's in, whether it's alive or whether it's dead. If you salted your meat, if you dried your meat, if you brined your meat, if you made your meat into sausages or even into pies, you could keep it for a very long time and, of course, transport it very easily, very long distances.
And if it's live, then effectively you're droving. And that was a huge part of the kind of British season, wasn't it? Huge numbers of animals being driven large distances.
It really, really was. I mean, right from thousands of years ago, you would have cattle being moved on the hoof from one place to another. And you hear amazing stories of turkeys, for example, being driven down from Norfolk, having first been walked through tar and then sawdust or sand so their feet would be all right for the journey. Then they'd be fattened up for the Christmas market.
I wonder, what about unusual circumstances, say the civil wars of the Middle Ages or early modern period or royal progresses? How easy was it for commissars for logistics officers to source meat in those circumstances?
Well, wars are obviously tremendously disruptive, and one of the big problems for any army, especially if it was an invading army, was how did you manage the population and the food?
Yeah, which we saw with the Romans.
Exactly. So if you wanted to invade a country and then keep it, you didn't really want to invade it and then eat all of its food. So you did often get very, very long supply chains going back to the place of origin. You find in civil wars things are even more disruptive. If you look at the siege, for example, of Pontefract Castle, those who are besieged...
This is in the English
Civil War. The people who are being besieged can get out at first, and they regularly come out of the castle and they go off on raids. As the siege gets worse and worse and worse, they find themselves really stuck between a rock and a hard place, because the townspeople hate them because they're eating all their food, and yet they've also got this very, very hostile army. So it's very difficult indeed.
Now, finally today, to something we're calling hyperlink history. You know, when you go online, you look something up, and then you find yourself clicking on a link to something else. It can be a complete distraction. But it's possibly more fun than the online supermarket shopping, and it can have the quality of serendipity, taking you somewhere fascinating that you would never otherwise have visited. We asked the stand-up comedian and history podcaster Izzy Lawrence to take a look at the county represented so ably by Helen Wall earlier in Top Town History, Cumbria, and let's see where we end up.
When I think of Cumbria, I think of Barrow-in-Furness, I think of Melvyn Bragg, and I think of the Cumberland sausage. And when I research the Cumberland sausage, one name crops up.
Peter Gott.
Hello, Peter Gott.
How can I help?
If you Google Cumberland sausages, well, your name comes up very quickly. How come you are the man to speak to about Cumberland sausages?
Well, being very frustrated in the year 2000 when Foot and Mouth hit, we decided we would apply for the accolade you would get from Europe to identify that that product should only be made in the region of Cumbria.
And I presume history was important in your argument for getting those rights.
Correct. We have one producer who can identify his recipe back to 1828. But in those days, we didn't know where that had originated from, and we were told that it could have been German miners who had come to work the slate mines at Ullswater. However, with the sort of spice imports to the Whitehaven port, which was probably the second biggest port in the UK at that time, there was a big influence of spices like pepper, nutmeg, mace, all that sort of stuff from the Caribbean, which actually had effect on other products like Grasmere gingerbread, Cumberland rum Nicky. And so I think that that influence went into the pot as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Oh, he had an amazing accent. Good old Peter. His website's really good as well. Lots and lots of meat. Oh wow. He's even selling wild boar. Wild boar always makes me think of Obelix from the Asterix books, because that was his favourite food. He liked punching Romans and he liked wild boar. But I wonder, what is the history of wild boar in the UK? Hang on, let's just look that up. Historic wild boar images. And, oh wow, there's lots of helmets. With they're like old Anglo-Saxon helmets with wild boars sort of arching their backs as a crest. Instead of like a Roman feather, you've got a pig on your head. I know who's going to know about this. There's only one place, the British Museum.
Hi, I'm Sue Bunning and I'm curator of the European Early Medieval Collections at the British Museum.
Hello. Why were the Anglo-Saxons so into wild boars? They've got them all over their helmets.
That's true, yes. We find images of them on dress accessories, on pendants and bracelets and buckles and things like that. But as you say, also particularly on helmets. So there are only 4 complete helmets that survive from Anglo-Saxon England, and 3 of them actually have boars on them.
But why boars? I mean, were they really into sausages?
They probably did like eating those sorts of things, yeah, absolutely. But We have a few clues from archaeology and also from later poetry. There's the poem Beowulf that describes helmets being worn by warriors that are impenetrable because they have these symbols of the boars on them. And if we think about what boars are like as animals, they're these huge kind of bags of muscles. So you can imagine how they would have understood these animals as being very powerful, very aggressive, the type of animal that you might aspire to have as a kind of protective device.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. So let's take a look at some more of these Anglo-Saxon boars. Well, what's this one? The Gilden Morden boar, 6th or 7th century Anglo-Saxon copper alloy figure of a boar. It was found by Herbert Fordman while digging for coprolite. Isn't that dinosaur poo that you get at museums? Coprolites. I'm going to have to find out about this. Right, let's Google coprolites. What do we get? Oh, hello, here's a paper by a man called Berridge Eve. Now, that is an amazing name, so we're going to have to look at this. Trimley St Martin and the coprolite mining rush. What? There was a mining, like a gold rush, but for dinosaur poo. I'm going to have to contact this man. Hi, is that Berridge Eve?
Yeah, hi, Eddie.
Where is Trimley?
So Trimley is on the east side of Suffolk.
And what is coprolite?
The actual literal meaning of coprolite is fossilised dung, but the coprolite that was mined was really fossilised sort of animal remains that have transformed into phosphate-rich type minerals.
Excellent, because that does make a lot of sense. Because previously I was thinking that all of these animals must have got together and organised some sort of sewage system of where to all, I thought that's unlikely. So, when did they start mining?
So it became a bit more industrial in sort of the 19th century. But it was started to be used as fertiliser and processed in the early 18th century, I think. So I think 1717 was the earliest date I saw.
So there you have it. Sausages, Anglo-Saxon helmets and fertiliser. Well, not so much fertiliser as a rich seam of compressed dead animals and poo. Talking of which, I better double-check my tax return.
Izzy Lawrence. Annie, where, apart from prehistoric poo, are people in the pre-industrial period getting their fertiliser from?
Well, the main fertiliser is manure, usually animal manure, but also what's known as night soil, which is human manure. But there are lots of other sources as well, and one of the biggest ones is actually bone. The Brits gain a really bad reputation in the late 18th century and the early 19th century for pillaging the battlefields of Europe to dig up human bones to use for the agrarian revolution in Britain.
So they're going over to the battlefield of Waterloo, digging it up and bringing it back to
exactly. So they're digging up the
power
bodies.
The agrarian revolution.
Yeah, the teeth are going off people's false teeth and the bones are going onto the soil. And the argument is that these are British soldiers who have died in the service of Britain and therefore their bones are being put to a really good use to feed British people back home.
Back to the future. And if you'd like to suggest a starting point for another Hyperlink History, then please do get in touch. The email address is making.history@bbc.co.uk. My thanks to Dr. Annie Gray for her culinary and historical insights. Next week, we'll be looking at how just a few years after IKEA was founded, Swedish flat-packed houses helped to solve our last housing crisis. And we rage against the machine as the mythical Captain Swing provokes disorder in the threshing barns of rural Georgian England. That's Making History with Helen next Tuesday at 3:30.